Right, fellow sociology droids, ready for another deep dive.
Always.
This time we're taking on a classic, Stanley Cohen's Folk Devils and Moral Panics.
A classic for sure.
And you know we're not messing around here. This one's for the grad students.
Oh, yeah. Deep dive indeed.
We're going deep into the arguments, the methodology, all the examples.
The nitty-gritty.
The nitty-gritty, exactly.
Buckle up.
Buckle up. So, Cohen uses this fascinating case study, right? The mods and rockers.
Mods and rockers. 1960s Britain.
1960s Britain. But before we get to, like, the scooters and the motorcycles and all that.
The clashes.
Yeah, the clashes. We need to lay some groundwork.
Foundation.
What even is a moral panic? According to Cohen, I mean. How does he define it?
Well, he describes it as this condition, episode, person, or group of persons who emerge and become defined as this threat.
A threat.
To societal values and interests. So it's not always about, like, actual danger, right? It's about perception.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so it's how we define deviance, not just, deviance itself.
Exactly.
But Cohen doesn't stop there, right?
No.
He gives us a framework.
A whole framework for how moral panics develop, how they play out. 5 stages, in fact.
Ooh, 5 stages. So what's the first stage?
Stage 1 is inventory.
Inventory.
Think of it like taking stock of the situation.
So this is when the media comes in.
Yeah.
Starts reporting on, the problem.
You got it. Cohen says, let me see, a deviance inventory where they exaggerate. Frequency, severity of, whatever events are related to that threat.
So it's not just reporting. It's framing a narrative, even if the reality is way less dramatic.
Absolutely. And he has these great examples from the newspapers, covering the mods and rockers, Day of Terror by scooter gangs, for instance. Wild Ones invade Seaside, just completely blowing things out of proportion.
Oh, yeah, classic sensationalism.
Classic.
Playing on fear. That's how you grab those readers.
Exactly. And that's where Cohen gets into this idea of ritualistic clashes.
Ritualistic clash.
The media isn't just reporting on events, they're shaping them, creating this script, almost like the mods and rockers are, expected to follow.
Oh, wow. So this reciprocal typification thing he talks about.
Yes. Each group starts seeing the other as a threat, and they act accordingly, fulfilling those roles the media's given them.
It's almost like the media is
a participant.
A participant, not just an observer. That's a little creepy, honestly.
It is a little Orwellian.
Yeah. So we've got the media setting the stage. What's next? How do they choose a target? Like, how do these perceptions actually stick to a group?
That's where stage 2 comes in. Symbolization.
Symbolization.
Certain objects, behaviors, styles, they become symbols of the perceived threat.
So basically, visual shorthand for trouble.
Exactly. And Cohen really gets into, like, how these symbols function. They tap into these anxieties, stereotypes. For the mods, it was the scooters, the parkas, the haircuts.
Representing that...
that new working class.
Yeah.
Upwardly mobile, challenging the old ways.
And for the rockers, it was...
the leather jackets, the motorcycles.
Yes. Oh, yeah, the motorcycles. That whole image of, like, rebellious masculinity.
Exactly. And these symbols, they weren't just random.
Oh, no.
They were chosen, amplified by the media.
Right.
To create this easily identifiable enemy.
So you see a scooter, you see a leather jacket, boom, instant threat. Don't even need to know anything about these groups.
Right.
That's messed up, honestly. Pretty effective, though.
Very effective.
Okay, so what happens next? How does this symbolic association, how does it actually lead to, like, real consequences for the folk devils?
All right, that brings us to stage 3, prediction.
Prediction.
The media, public figures, they start predicting these future outbreaks, reinforcing the idea that this problem is getting worse. Something must be done.
The classic self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. If you're expecting trouble, you're going to see it, even if it's not really there.
So Cohen, he actually analyzed, like, quotes from newspapers and stuff.
Oh, yeah. Interviews with authorities. They're constantly predicting violence, promising to, crack down on the mods and rockers.
It's almost like they were...
inviting conflict.
Inviting conflict, just to prove their point. This moral panic thing, it's like it feeds on itself.
Absolutely. It creates its own justification.
So, okay. Let's say there is some trouble, some actual incidents. Cohen doesn't say there was no conflict between the mods and rockers, right?
Yeah, he acknowledges that there were incidents, but he says the media, they always exaggerated.
They exaggerated.
The scale, the severity, stage 4, exaggeration and distortion.
So not making things up, but taking real events, blowing them way out of proportion.
Precisely. Minor scuffles become riots. Vandalism becomes mayhem. Rumors, hearsay, suddenly they're facts.
And the language they use, I bet Cohen had a field day with that.
Oh, he analyzes it meticulously, emotionally charged words,
Yeah.
creating a sense of panic, outrage.
So a deliberate manipulation of the narrative, using language to shape perception, fuel the panic.
Exactly.
And they always focus on the most sensational stuff, right? Leaving out anything that didn't fit the narrative.
Oh, yeah. He talks about how, a lot of these kids were just bored teenagers looking for excitement, a sense of belonging.
They weren't all, like, inherently bad or anything.
Right. And there were even times when mods and rockers mixed peacefully, but you wouldn't read about that in the headlines.
It's like the media needed the panic to keep going, even if it meant twisting the truth.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we've talked about the media, the symbols, the exaggeration. But what about the people themselves, the mods and rockers? How did the moral panic actually affect them?
That's where stage 5 comes in. Spurious attribution.
Spurious attribution.
They start attaching these negative traits to the folk devils. It's how they demonize them. And it justifies all those actions taken against them.
So you paint them as inherently bad, dangerous, even if their actions don't really justify that?
Exactly. Cohen looked at court transcripts, interviews with authorities. They were always saying things like lack of respect, moral weakness, even psychological instability.
Oh, and was there any evidence to back that up?
Often it was based on stereotypes, flimsy evidence, but it was crucial for justifying the crackdown, which, by the way, was getting pretty harsh.
Right.
Yeah.
So the moral panic, it's not just about perceptions. It's about using those perceptions to control and punish. It's like the panic makes its own justification for a crackdown. But what did that crackdown actually look like? What happens when the control culture starts to react?
That's where things get really interesting. Cohen's analysis of the control culture's response, the police, the courts, the lawmakers, it's fascinating. He shows how the moral panic creates this climate where these extreme measures, they're not just tolerated, they're demanded. He uses this term, right? Control culture. For those institutions, the individuals who enforce social norms. And during a moral panic, well, they tend to overreact, meaning harsher measures, disproportionately targeting those folk devils.
It's not just like a few stricter laws then, or more police on the streets. It's a bigger shift.
Exactly, a fundamental shift. How society responds to deviance changes.
So, concrete examples. What did this control culture escalation actually look like with the mods and rockers?
Well, Cohen really gets into the police response, He looked at court records, police reports, he even interviewed officers, and he saw this pattern.
A pattern of?
Excessive force, lots of arrests, even brutality in some cases. He points out that officers were often encouraged to, make an example of these kids.
This is for minor stuff.
Yeah. The moral panic, it created this climate where the police felt justified, cracking down hard, even if it meant, violating those young people's rights.
So basically no presumption of innocence, just being a mod or a rocker. That was enough to get you in trouble.
Pretty much. He talks about these preemptive arrests, like they detain kids just based on how they looked or who they hung out with. No crime committed.
Wow. And they'd confiscate their scooters, their motorcycles.
Oh, yeah. No legal basis, really. Just to disrupt their gathering.
It's like they were trying to erase their whole identity, just wipe them out. But what about the courts? Were they caught up in this too?
Oh, absolutely. The courts, they legitimized it all, reinforced the control culture's response. Cohen looked at transcripts, sentencing records, and the judges. Harsher sentences for the mods and rockers, compared to other kids for the same offenses.
It wasn't just a few biased judges, then it was like a systemic thing.
Systemic, yeah. He highlights these vague laws they used, breach of the peace, things like that, gave them a lot of leeway, to target these kids.
And they relied on those stereotypes about the mods and rockers, didn't they? To justify their decisions.
All the time. It's like the legal system itself. It got infected by this panic. They abandoned due process, fairness, all in the name of, protecting society. And Cohen argues that this response, it wasn't just about controlling the mods and rockers, then. It set a precedent, a message to everyone else.
Don't step out of line.
Exactly. The moral panic, it created this climate. Fear, intolerance, anything different, anything outside the norm, it was a potential threat.
So they made an example out of the mods and rockers
Yeah.
to scare everyone else into conformity.
Yeah.
But Cohen goes even further, right? This idea of an exclusive control culture that emerges from a moral panic. What's that about?
Yeah, so exclusive control culture, think of it like specific institutions, policies, practices aimed solely at controlling and punishing the folk devils, even after the initial panic, dies down.
So you create a whole system for a problem that might not have even been that big in the first place.
Yeah, and this system, it often outlives the panic itself, becomes part of the fabric of society.
Wow. So what did that look like with the mods and rockers? Any examples of this exclusive control culture?
Oh, yeah. He points to, special police units dedicated to youth gangs, curfews, exclusion zones, all specifically targeting mods and rockers, even social programs aimed at rehabilitating them.
So it wasn't just punishment then. It was control, surveillance, trying to change who these kids were.
Exactly. But he also talks about how moral panics can be exploited, right, by different groups with their own agendas.
Oh, right. So it's not just about this, organic social reaction. Other people are using it to their advantage. Makes sense.
Yeah. One type is commercial exploitation. Businesses profiting off that fear.
Ah, yes. Disaster capitalism never fails.
Cohen mentions, security systems, alarm systems, even self-defense classes. Sales went way up during this time.
Cashing in on the panic.
Yeah.
Lovely. What were the other kinds of exploitation?
Well, there's ideological exploitation, where the panic is used to push political agendas or reinforce existing power structures.
So using the panic to justify their own goals?
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't actually address the problem.
Exactly. He gives examples of how, right-wing politicians use the fear of juvenile delinquency to push for tougher laws, harsher punishments. But they ignored the economic factors that contributed to youth crime. Right. And he also talks about how the panic was used to justify, increased police powers, surveillance, which, eroded civil liberties for everyone, not just the mods and rockers.
Yeah, it's like the moral panic. It becomes this tool for social control, cracking down on anyone who dissents.
That's a good way to put it. But there's another type of exploitation, too. Cohen calls it exploitation as amusement.
Amusement? That doesn't sound very exploitative.
It might seem counterintuitive, but he argues that the folk devils, they can become objects of ridicule, entertainment. Think of those satirical cartoons, the mocking news segments, even novelty songs, all making fun of the mods and rockers.
I guess it's a way to distance yourself from the problem, huh? Make it seem less threatening, if you can laugh at it.
Maybe. But Cohen says this kind of mockery, even if it seems harmless, it contributes to dehumanizing the folk devils, makes it easier to justify the way they're treated.
Oh, right, because if they're just a joke, then it doesn't matter if we treat them badly.
Exactly, and it reinforces those negative stereotypes, those prejudices, further marginalizes them.
Wow. This is all pretty heavy stuff. But Cohen doesn't stop there, right? He goes beyond just the mods and rockers. He tries to understand the bigger picture, the historical and social conditions that made them such potent symbols of threat.
Right. He connects them to these broader social and cultural shifts happening in Britain at the time. It's not just an isolated incident.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What were some of those key factors? What was it about the 1960s, about Britain at that time, that made the mods and rockers so scary to people?
Post-war Britain, lots of anxieties, especially with all the changes happening.
Changes like?
Social, economic, everything. The economy was booming, so, rising affluence, more consumerism, these youth subcultures popping up everywhere.
Challenging the old ways.
Exactly. And that created a lot of uncertainty about the future. People felt like things were changing too fast.
So the mods and rockers, they weren't just troublemakers. They were symbols of this unsettling change.
That's it. The mods, with their style, their modern music, fashion, they represented this new working class, aspirational, threatening to break down those old class boundaries.
And the rockers.
Or rockers tapped into anxieties about masculinity, the changing role of men, those motorcycles, that rebellious attitude. It all played into that.
It's amazing how Cohen connects those superficial things, style and stuff, to these deeper fears. But he doesn't just talk about the big picture, right? He looks at the mods and rockers themselves, too.
Oh, yeah. He says it's important to understand them on their own terms, not just as projections of society's anxieties. He wants to get to the real people behind the stereotypes.
So he did interviews Went and observed them, even looked at their magazines and stuff.
Exactly. He wanted to paint a more nuanced picture, not just rely on the media's portrayal.
So who were the mods and rockers, according to Cohen? What were they all about?
Well, he argues that both groups, in a way, were products of that post-war boom. Young people had more money, more freedom than ever before. They wanted to express themselves, enjoy life.
So not necessarily rebelling against everything, but definitely forging their own path.
Right. The mods, with their sharp clothes, their love of soul music, R&B, they were all about style sophistication. They wanted to move up in the world.
And the scooters were a big part of that, right?
Yeah.
The symbol of that freedom, that upward mobility.
Absolutely. More than just transport, an extension of their identity, a way to show their individuality, their desire for a better life.
But the rockers, different vibe.
Yeah. More rooted in that traditional working class masculinity, strength, toughness, rebellion. They express themselves through their bikes, their leather jackets, rock and roll music.
So you had these two groups, each with their own style, their own values, coming from a similar place, but expressing it in different ways. And then the media, the control culture, they swoop in and turn them into enemies.
And that demonization, Cohen argues, it actually made the conflict worse. The constant media attention, the police harassment, the court cases, it all led to more tension, more division.
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Right.
The more they were portrayed as enemies, the more they became enemies. But Cohen also points out that the mods and rockers weren't just like passive victims in all this.
Oh no, they knew how to play the game.
They knew the media was watching.
And they used it. Some of them would even exaggerate their behavior, knowing it would get them attention, reinforce that image of rebellion.
Cohen even quotes one rocker,
Yeah.
right? Saying something like, "We give the press what they want, violence."
Yeah. They were aware of the narrative.
Yeah.
And they used it to their advantage.
That's wild. But before we wrap up, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. Cohen says that even though the mods and rockers were the focus of the panic in the 60s, they weren't the only ones targeted. He sees this as part of a bigger pattern.
Definitely. He points to other moral panics throughout history, different groups, different times, but the same basic pattern. Someone becomes the scapegoat, the folk devil.
And it's all tied to those anxieties, those power dynamics of the time.
Exactly. So his framework, it's not just about mods and rockers. It's about how societies create deviance and use it to maintain control.
A tool for social control.
Yeah.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive into folk devils and moral panics. Hopefully this has given you a good overview of Cohen's work, those arguments, the methodology, the historical context. Until next time, fellow sociology droids, keep those minds sharp.